Welcome to Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a
What's
light
your
on
story?
incredible individuals. What does accessibility mean to you?
What's your mission? Welcome all to accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a light on incredible individuals and organizations and the work that they do. I'm your host, Josh Basil. I'm a C45 quadriplegic, paralyzed below my shoulders, and a power wheelchair user. I'm the Community Relations Manager at accessiBe and a passionate disability rights advocate and trial attorney, focused on breaking down barriers to access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Today on accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions, we are joined by Dr. Lauren, the CEO and founder of Think Dyslexia and the creator of Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast. Welcome, Dr. Lauren.
Hi, Josh. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you on the program today, so let's jump right into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your story.
Yes. So let's see here. I consider myself a special educator, even though I left the classroom in schools last year. But really what drew me to special education is my own neurodiversities. So I was diagnosed with ADHD about 15 years ago, and school was always hard for me. So I really connected with the struggling learner in schools. And so knowing that I always wanted to kind of figure out how my brain worked and what was good for me in school, I think that made me a better educator. And I think it also makes me a better mom too. So I'm a mom, educator, edupreneur, if you will. I just love being creative, and I love just really spreading the word about things we need to talk about, such as dyslexia and language-based learning differences. And I always say literacy and writing are a civil right. And so when we are not preparing our students in schools and our teachers, that really causes some serious issues in our American schools and really globally. So that's a little bit about myself.
And what exactly is dyslexia, and what do you wish more people knew about it?
Right, sure. So I get this question a lot. I think the basic thing that I like to share with folks who are not aware of dyslexia is it is truly a language-based learning difference or disability. Now, I will say I use both of those interchangeably for my own work. So I am not dyslexic. However, I've interviewed dyslexics who have said it is a difference because they were diagnosed at 7, 8, they got the right intervention, and it really opened up doors for them because of their creativity. But I've also interviewed adults that have dyslexia who were maybe diagnosed at 30, dropped out of high school, couldn't really apply for jobs because they couldn't read and they didn't have the skills to really, be productive people in society. And so that's why I use it interchangeably. But I will say that it's important for people to know that if you look at scans of the brain, there's a typical brain and then there's the dyslexic brain. And what I want teachers to know is that dyslexics aren't lazy. It's just their brain is wired differently. And so in the typical brain, there are 3 areas that are lit up when a child is learning to read. And then somehow they just have those neurons create and they know how to read. But with our dyslexics, there's only one part of the brain that's in the back of the brain that's lit up. So that's why you have to have a multisensory approach. That's why you have to have a different way, a non-traditional way to teach these dyslexic learners so all of those areas can connect. So it's really, truly a difference / disability. And then the best way that I can really relate this to people is when you think about autism, it's a spectrum. Dyslexia is a spectrum. You might have someone who is severely dyslexic or someone who's mildly dyslexic. But I will say, when you've met one dyslexic, you've met one dyslexic.
I love the way you teach, the way you explain things, and I never knew that about the brain and the way that it lights up differently, and it makes so much more sense that with that being a difference there, you have to approach it in different ways to kind of stimulate or get it through and teach, and I love that. What are some of the main challenges faced by people with this dyslexia, and how does this differ or compare to dysgraphia?
Okay, that's a really good question, Josh. So I want to really zoom out. I think the biggest thing that dyslexics struggle with is not what people think. Yes, it's reading. Yes, it might be writing, but it's really that confident social emotional piece. Because if you really think about it, kids know at a very young age, as young as kindergarten, that something is wrong with them. So it could be just the subliminal messages where the teacher's getting frustrated because they don't know their letter sounds, or they aren't able to blend them together to create those words. And then eventually we're learning to read, but then we read to learn. So the confidence piece really is what deteriorates those dyslexics who aren't getting what they need. So that translates into behavioral issues as students get older. And so I've worked in secondary schools where I've been a middle school special educator, where I've seen brown and black boys will act out, and they would rather go to the office because it's embarrassing for them to show that they can't read. They're not on the same level as their peers, or if they can read, they're probably at a second grade level. So it's imperative for us to really understand what this disability is, difference in disability, how it impacts our students, and how we can really get ahead of that. So that social emotional piece is huge. Now, to touch on dysgraphia, there are several types of dysgraphia. So the best way that I can explain it is there's literally that pincer grip, that dexterity, that fine motor. So if you think of, and I know you have kids, Josh, so if you think about kids when they're younger, like them gripping things, can they cut? I have a 5.5-year-old who is going to kindergarten, and in her Montessori program, they would do pin punching. So that's really getting that fine motor. So there's that fine motor dysgraphia, and that can be really corrected with an occupational therapist at a young age. But then when you work with older kids, like where I have worked with 4th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders, it could be writing. So it could be that receptive and expressive language. And that is a whole other conversation where, depending on the learner, they could be understanding what you're saying, but can't get it out, or vice versa. Or they have so much in their head, they don't even know where to begin, and it's overwhelming. So it's not uncommon for you to meet a dyslexic who also has dysgraphia.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I could talk about this forever, Josh.
Well, I feel like I could learn from you. I mean, like, Dr. Lauren, you're amazing at teaching and making it into simple terms the way that it's digestible.
Thank you.
It's a talent in its own right. And do you think as a society we do enough to make accommodations for people with learning disabilities, and where could we do better?
Yeah, absolutely not. That's my short answer. I don't think we do. I do think that we are slowly moving the needle. So, for example, you and I are talking about disabilities. I worked at a nonprofit whose mission was focused on inclusive education. And we would go into a variety of Maryland schools. I know we're both Marylanders, and we would go to different districts, and we would really talk about all means all. So we're not going to have severely disabled children that are in the room down the hall who are not included, because that's not inclusion. And so I think that as a society, we don't really know what it feels like to be in a position of being disabled until you actually are, or there's someone in your circle or your life that you can see it impacting them. And I think that's when people start to wake up. Now, you can have a physical disability, or you can obviously have something that some folks might call invisible disability. So for me, people would not assume that I have a learning difference. I'm going to call it a difference. But, ADHD can impact in a variety of different ways, and I've lived it. But I think that, I still think there's a lot of room for growth. I'll put it that way. Because, it's a whole variety of how are we including all, meaning all, in society, in jobs, in that social emotional piece, all of those things.
You make a good point the way that you said, it's not a matter of if, but when. Disability is either going to touch you or someone around you.
Yeah.
And like for me, growing up, I really knew nothing about disability because all my grandparents were healthy, and they didn't hit those kind of markers, or I didn't have enough people in my school system that really I knew with a disability. I had my own disabilities, I guess. I had ADHD and a reading disability, but like all I really knew about disability, at least from how I kind of was taught about it, was that Superman was paralyzed.
Yes.
But then once I had my own disability, or you have a loved one with a disability, or you're in a field where you're working that impacts people with disability, you start learning just so much more about the different perspectives, the different abilities, and the different approaches to allowing those people to not only survive but thrive.
Yeah, no, and people don't realize this, but like going to the grocery store, are there ramps? Are there ways that people like yourself, you have a motorized wheelchair? Like, can you get into the store? Can you actually, like, there are a whole bunch of things that the average person doesn't think about, and I think that that's where we need to do better as a society.
Well, and you get into the store, and then once you're in the store, how are you going to have a good experience? And I feel like my next question kind of leads to this. But like with websites, people can get on websites, but once they're on it, how are they going to experience it? So like, what is it about websites that make them inaccessible for people with dyslexia and dysgraphia?
Yeah. So actually, before I answer the dyslexia and dysgraphia question, I actually want to say I have a dear friend of mine who developed a visual impairment later in life. So she's like a mom to me. So she's in her early 60s and her son has autism. So she understood disabilities as a mom advocating for her child. But it wasn't until she lost her vision. She can see, but very low vision, where when we interact and I'll send her things, like she's actually said, your website has really bright pastel colors and it's hard for me to read. And honestly, for me, I was like, I didn't even think about that. So I think when you talk about websites, it's not even just for dyslexics. I mean, it's for people with low vision and all of these things that we don't consider. It's more like, oh, I like the way this looks. But like, if you have a website that's a business, let's say, you have to convey the message, not necessarily in how pretty it looks. You want to make sure it's accessible for all.
And you have to tell a story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And make sure that they can absorb that story.
Right.
That story and get from the beginning to end, just like everyone else.
Right. Right.
Maybe it's not like everyone else. At least they can get there and they're not blocked from making that way.
Yeah. But in regards to dyslexics, I think, there's research that supports there's certain dyslexic fonts that work best. I have found, speaking with dyslexic friends and colleagues, that varies by person. I mean, like some people are like Comic Sans is great, and then other people can read Times New Roman. It really depends. But I know for me with my ADHD, like when I read on Kindles or even my phone, it has to have a black background. Like something about that background makes it easier for me to process information. And I've heard with some dyslexics, there's that background text popping out, size, all of those things, they can impact your experience, I should say. So
they can be barriers.
Yeah. And so I think it is interesting that you asked that, because how can we make websites more accessible? I mean, that's actually something I really need to think about with my website, honestly. So
what are some common content mistakes that might make it difficult for people online with websites, especially with dyslexia, to be able to absorb it?
Josh, that is really a question I can't answer immediately. Like, I'm really thinking, I'm like, I've never had that question asked, and it really makes me think, what is that experience? I think what I will do, because I can't speak from a dyslexic's perspective since I'm not dyslexic, but I actually want to ask some of my dyslexic friends, like, when you go on this website or even your website, how did you develop it knowing that you have these struggles? Because I think that is a really good point to make, especially knowing we're in such a digital world these days. Now, I will say, I did meet a gentleman who will be on my podcast who created an app called My Dys, like dyslexia, DYS. And it is a way where you can have your phone and you can scan in homework assignments and anything really, and it can read it to you. You can change the font color. So it's almost like you're translating it for you. And I think that that's really cool because, there's an app for everything these days. So that really could be a way for more accessibility. And I think that we're moving in that direction, where I know they're dyslexic pens, which are ridiculously expensive. Like, I don't think that that's really for like the mainstream population. But I think that there are ways that we are thinking more about technology and including that with our dyslexic learners.
I'm a big fan of technology.
Yes.
it definitely, it changes the narrative, and it just gets better and better with time. If you can give a business businesses kind of around the world one tip on what they can do better to make the world more accessible for people with learning disabilities, what could that one tip be?
One tip. Wow. All right. I think now this is a hard one because I tend to be very introspective. And I know most people may not be, but that is my tip. Maybe stop and get to know people in the context that forces you to step outside of your comfort zone. So, for example, Josh, you have a story, right? So people might look at you and maybe with their own biases, they might be afraid to approach you. They might be afraid to talk to you, which I know you live this, which is crazy because you're a person with feelings, you have a story. So it's just, I think that if we can just talk to people, get to know them, I think that, human contact makes a huge difference. It's like people don't realize it, but it makes a massive difference. And I got to tell you, when I worked at my nonprofit, I worked with a woman who was amazing. I learned so much from her. She was paralyzed from the waist down and she got in a car accident when she was like 25. And so I got to really know her. And she would just tell me how it was challenging for her to do just daily things that, able-bodied people don't think about. But what I loved about her was her perseverance. What I loved about her was her confidence and her positivity. And also I learned a lot about her independence. She really wanted to be able to roll in her wheelchair and open the door to get inside rather than looking like, hey, someone come help me. And it was just interesting to hear and see her perspective. And I lived it too. Like I saw people that would be like running in the parking lot trying to open the door for her. And she's like, I can get it myself. So I just think it's those stories where it's just like, we have to talk about these things. We have to normalize them. We have to understand that everybody has a story and everybody, that creates who they are in that present moment too.
Well said. Well said. And what is one misconception about people with dyslexia that you'd like to debunk?
That they're not smart. I think that's the biggest thing that I can really say, that they're not intelligent. And I think that is a misconception because what is intelligence? You have to kind of ask that question. People can have high emotional IQ. They can be really agriculturally intelligent. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can view intelligence, but I think society deems, the I don't even know what the traditional intelligence is, but I think in regards to dyslexia, it's, oh, you can't read, so you're not smart, when really it has nothing to do with that. So let's debunk that myth right now.
Dr. Lauren, thank you so much for being our guest today on accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions. Really enjoyed our conversations here.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.
And to all of our guests, thank you so much for staying to the end. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and follow us at accessiBe_community. And as always, thank you for being on this journey. Bye, everyone. Bye, Dr. Lauren.
Bye.
Bye.